I used to hate eating steaks, and now I've cooked and eaten more than 100 just in the past 100 days. Finding a way to make a steak that costs less than $10 tastes better than ones I've paid closer to 100 for at restaurants using only 2 ingredients. You might think you need to doll up a steak with all sorts of marinades and spices, but that's probably either because you're not cooking it properly or you're choosing a cut of steak that you don't naturally enjoy. For me, there's a king of steaks whose reign is unquestionable, and that's the ribeye, which is what we're going to cook today, but you can apply this method to just about any cut of beef. With a good cut of steak, we want to minimize the ingredients to things that are going to enhance the beef's natural flavor, which in this case includes salt and beef tallow. Beef tallow is rendered beef fat, meaning that you heat beef fat over a low temperature and extract the grease, which you can then use to cook with. And this has all sorts of benefits, but the main one that we're looking at in this situation is that it's going to enhance the natural flavors of the beef better than any other oil or butter that I've ever tried. There's a link in the description below this video to another video that I made explaining how to get beef fat for free and render it into tallow. If you're interested, check that out. You can also buy it from a lot of butchers. Choose your preferred salt. I'm going with pink Himalayan. Whatever it is, pick something that's fine ground because you want it to penetrate deep into the meat. The biggest decision after choosing the meat is choosing your cooking method, whether you're going to sear it in a pan or cook it on a grill. The benefit of searing your steak in a pan is that you're going to get this beautiful golden brown crust which tastes delicious, and you're basting the steak in its own juices, allowing it to absorb more flavor. The downside is that you might be frying to the sound of your fire alarm, while if you don't clean with the ferocity of a janitorial staff, you might turn your floor into a skating rink. If you want to avoid the noise and the splatter, then you can go with the grilling option, which is also going to give you some beautiful grill marks that look great on Instagram, but don't taste as good in your mouth as the golden brown sear from the pan. You're also losing a lot of the fat as it's dripping through the grill, where you would be basting the steak in this fat if you were frying it in the pan. So you're sacrificing taste for cleanliness. And since we're going for the perfect steak, we're choosing the pan sear method. And you might be seeing people saying that you need to cook in a cast iron pan. And while there may be some small amount of truth to this, I've cooked over 100 steaks in the past 100 days and can tell no discernible difference whether I'm cooking on cast iron, carbon steel, stainless steel, or even non-stick pans. The most important thing is to cook it over very high heat, and the heavier the pan, the better it's going to retain the heat across its surface area. So choose the heaviest pan that you have access to, but don't worry if it's not cast iron or carbon steel. Another thing you might be familiar with if this isn't the first steak cooking video that you've watched is that people will say you can do all sorts of things with the meat, like cook it in the oven before searing it in the pan, sear it in the pan and then cook it in the oven. I would not recommend doing any of that unless you want to overcomplicate the cooking process at the cost of overcooking your steak. Because unless you're working with something more than 3 inches, the heat from the pan is more than enough to bring up the internal temperature to medium rare. If you want it cooked above medium rare, then maybe you can use the oven method, but I would still just let it sear even longer and add to that golden brown crust. You got your steak, you got your ingredients, you know how you're going to make it. The next step is to take that steak out of the fridge 30 minutes before you want to cook it. Otherwise, the cold temperature of the steak is going to fight against the heat of the pan, making it harder to get that sear. So the closer you can get the steak to room temperature, the better. Take it out of the fridge, and even if it looks dry, pat it down to get some of that residual moisture off of it before hitting it with a generous portion of salt. Salting the steak immediately out of the fridge will give the salt more time to penetrate deeper into the steak, preventing it from falling off while cooking and drawing out additional moisture from the steak. Drawing out this moisture will give you an even better sear. If 30 minutes have gone by and somehow you're still not so tempted by the steak that you're considering just eating it raw, then you can leave it out for even longer. I've left steaks out for as long as 2, maybe even 3 hours and haven't had any issues. After a few hours, nothing but a better sear. Now we're ready to get cooking. So take your heaviest pan and heat it over medium-high to high heat. The higher the temperature, the better the sear is going to be, but it's also going to increase your chances of splattering your walls and setting off your fire alarm. Don't add anything to the pan, because the sooner that you add something to the pan, the sooner it has a chance of burning. If we apply everything at once, then we're going to be able to control the temperature much better. The other huge advantage that tallow has over butter and other cooking oils is that it has a higher smoke point, meaning that it's less likely to burn, although it's not impossible, which is why rather than adding it directly to the pan, we're going to apply the tallow to the steak. You can do this at room temperature or heat it up to apply a thinner layer. We don't want to add the steak to the pan too early, otherwise it's going to start cooking the internal temperature without searing the outside. When it starts feeling too hot to hold your hand above the pan for more than a few seconds, you know that your pan is in heat and ready to accept your meat. Slowly lower the steak into the pan and you should hear this sound. Lay the steak down in the pan facing away from you so you don't splash yourself with the grease, and then give it one firm press to make sure that the entire surface area of the steak is in contact with the surface area of the pan. Don't give it any more firm presses after this, just let it rest and absorb the heat. You can find different charts online for how long to cook a steak of a particular thickness to get it to the right level of doneness. For this steak that's 2.5 centimeters thick, I'm going to aim to cook it 2 minutes on each side. But these are all estimates because there's way too many variables that affect how a steak is cooked. The most popular recommendation that I've found for testing whether or not a steak is ready is by doing this touch test where this means rare, this means medium rare, this means well done. I found this to be the best way to ruin your steak because no matter where I'm touching on my hand or my arm, it's going to feel like a well done steak. Some people recommend using meat thermometers. However, I've found these to be wildly inconsistent, and using 2 separate thermometers in the same exact steak will give me 2 different readings. So rather than touching yourself, you want to finger the steak. When you first finger the steak, it's going to be soft and accepting. But as soon as you start feeling some resistance, it's going to be getting closer to medium rare and giving you indications that it's time to pull out. The more resistance you feel, the closer the steak is getting to well done. Medium rare seems to be soft to touch, but with some bounce back. This steak doesn't have any fat around the edges, but for demonstration purposes, you're going to want to sear the fat on the outer edges of the steak by holding it in the pan. Most of the recipes you find will tell you to pour whatever's left in the pan on top of your steak, but we don't need to do this because we're cooking the steak in beef tallow. If we want to add more fat, we can apply more of the tallow afterwards. This will give us the same flavor, but without the burnt remains. When you're done, put it on a plate, cover it with something like aluminum foil, and let it sit for 5 to 10 minutes. I've seen all sorts of things recommending that you leave it longer than this, which is a great idea if you love cold steak. I prefer to eat mine warm, so I'm gonna let it rest for 5 minutes before digging in. As you start slicing, you're going to realize that even if you followed all these steps perfectly, you're going to have different levels of doneness throughout the steak. That's because the steak has different levels of thicknesses throughout its surface area, and the closer that you get to a bone, the longer the steak's going to take to cook. I err on the side of undercooking because I prefer the taste, and if you really need to, you can always add it back to the heat. But if you overcook it, that's the steak you're stuck with. So in this video explaining how to make the perfect steak, I overcooked my steak. It turns out that it's actually quite difficult to cook and film yourself cooking simultaneously. But the beautiful part about this recipe is that even if you overcook the steak, every bite is still delicious. So next time you pick up a steak, get rid of all the extraneous ingredients, narrow yourself down to salt and tallow, and create the best steak that you'll ever taste. After trying one bite, you'll be questioning why your favorite steakhouse isn't hiring you as their top chef. This is the first time that I've ever made a cooking video, but I kind of enjoy cooking and would be willing to make some other videos if this is something you guys are interested in seeing. If you want to see some more, then give this video a like and let me know in the comments. Hopefully you're following these directions and enjoying your steak while questioning why you would ever visit a restaurant for a steak again. Because you can make the perfect steak with 2 simple ingredients.